Of the Ben Shapiro Show and co-founder of the Daily Wire. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, like we said, big week for Nazis in America. This story with Plattner is really wild. Maybe he knew it was a Nazi tattoo. Maybe he didn't. I think I would be a lot less offended by the whole thing if the left who is defending him now didn't spend the last decade calling people like you and me and anybody else in the MAGA movement Nazis. So how have you experienced this whole story?
I mean, I think that the funniest part of this is that many of the people who are somehow defending Plattner and saying he just didn't know, it was all ignorance, which, by the way, if you get a giant tattoo on your chest, and that was a pretty big tattoo, I have a feeling that he knew exactly what that was. And apparently he'd bragged to some friends, that was reported by Jewish Insider, that he knew what it was at the time. But many of the people who are defending him are the same people who are perfectly willing to condemn as Nazis, like the Israeli Defense Forces, who are fighting actual, honest-to-God, modern-day Nazis in Hamas. It is all extraordinarily dishonest. It is the idea that there's any principle here is beyond. But the truth is I think you're referencing, there has been a warmth toward Nazi imagery that exists on the left. It exists on the right. I think the right has been better overall at condemning it and calling it out. But there is a sort of edgelordism that has risen on all sides as a result of the breakdown of our institutions and the breakdown of sort of moral voices of authority. And that means that there is a lot of trash that has become kind of commonplace.
So there is a big debate happening on the right about how to handle it. Some are saying, like you have said, look, wherever this trash rears its ugly head, you have to denounce it, whether it's on your side or the other side. Others have made the argument that no, there are no enemies to my right, only to the left. We should focus on fighting the left. And when this stuff rears its head on our side, basically we should have a more tolerant view towards it. Explain to us that position and why it doesn't fly in the face of the exact kind of principles that the conservative movement has been claiming to be building up all this time.
Sure. So I think that it's really more a pragmatic position that then refracted through a moral lens. So my case has been that, morally speaking, you ought to be able to condemn bad things wherever they occur. And then pragmatically speaking, you ought not hand over leadership of your movement to the crazies. And that when you make room for the crazies, when you refuse to condemn the crazies, when you massage the crazies, you actually end up granting them an unearned leadership position and making them essentially immune from criticism, which gives them an upper hand. And this is exactly what happened pragmatically to the Democratic Party. Not only is that bad for your party, it's also bad for your electoral prospects, because it turns out that most Americans are somewhere in the middle. Most Americans are normies and don't particularly like Nazi ideology. To steelman the position, I think to steelman the position would be to say that if you have members of your coalition who engage in edgelordism or have bizarre views or even terrible views, so long as those views are the second worst views, you must actually side with those people in order to fight the people with the worst views. And that's sort of a coalitional argument. Now, again, I don't think that succeeds on pragmatic grounds. I don't think it succeeds on moral grounds either. But that, I think, would be the strongest articulation of that position.
Now, you have people at your company, the Daily Wire, who don't necessarily agree with you about everything. You're a big believer in free speech. How do you navigate that? On the one hand, having the widest tent possible, really supporting the free exchange of ideas, and on the other hand, doing all the things we're discussing here, fighting racism, keeping the sort of pro-Hitler element out of your coalition?
Sure. So I think that, first of all, we should make a large-scale distinction between deplatforming and also saying that I don't have to pay somebody to work for my company who violates my moral precepts or the moral precepts of the foundation of my company. I've never called for some of these figures to be booted off of social media. In fact, I've called for some of them who are quite egregious and whose followers threaten me on a regular basis. I've called for them to be restored to social media after they were banned from X or after they were banned from YouTube. That is a far cry from the idea that I have to treat their views with any sense of decency or pretend that their views are palatable or that they have some sort of right to work for the company that I am a founder of. And that, I think, is a really silly proposition. It's the difference between a platform like a YouTube and a publisher, which is what we are. We're a publisher. We get to determine the kind of stuff that we wish to have on our website and on our property. That is a different thing. So I think that distinction makes an awful lot of difference because, again, it's not anti-free speech to criticize somebody else's free speech, nor is it anti-free speech to say that you do not wish to expend money or support on people that you disagree with. In fact, that is an aspect of free speech. I don't have to spend money on people I disagree with. I don't have to pay them, and I don't have to patronize their businesses. I don't have to grant them a slot on the network that we run. At the same time, there's a difference between that and they should be thrown in jail. They should be thrown off of these kind of generic platforms that are not supposed to take a political position.
So by and large, over the last 2 weeks, we really have seen the right condemning the edgelordism, the people sort of defending, not condemning those young Republicans, for example, by and large, in my view, seems to have been more the influencers, more the very online right, and not so much main figures in the party. And you had, of course, the White House not nominating Ingrassia anymore. There was one notable exception, which was the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who refused to condemn these young Republicans. What did you make of that decision of his to sort of come out in defense of them, calling them kids?
So I think that there are two things going on. One is the vice president is obviously trying to build his own political coalition as he moves toward a 2028 run. He doesn't want to alienate potential voters. And that's not a rarity. You've seen that on pretty much all sides of the aisle when politicians who have electoral prospects don't wish to announce people who they see as possible sources of support. I think also that the vice president is making a calculated gamble that essentially there is more objection to what has now been broadly termed, I think wrongly, cancel culture than there is to some of these unpalatable and ugly views. And so cancel culture, first of all, I think was misdefined in the first place. Cancel culture was the idea originally that there are certain views that are so out of bounds that there should be social consequences that attach. And then we use the term cancel culture to describe the use of those social consequences for basically mainstream views. The Overton window had been shut so tightly that there were people who basically said that if you say a man is not a woman or a woman is not a man, that you thus should be hit with these social consequences. We called that cancel culture. That was then depixelated. And people thought that what cancel culture now meant was any criticism of any view. And so it turned into a thing where if you say, no, these sort of Nazi views, I don't like them, I think they're wrong, and I think they're immoral, people will then accuse you of engaging in cancel culture, which is, again, I think a misuse of the term. It's a category error. But if that is the broad perception that criticism of ideas or criticism of people is a form of quote unquote cancellation, you can see why a political figure might say, okay, you know what? I'm quote unquote anti-cancellation. And so I'm just not going to engage in condemning pretty much anything. Now, again, I don't think that the vice president is necessarily totally consistent in his view of this. I do think there's a difference between a private group chat and some of the public statements that have been made, or some of the people who are in the group chat and some of these open political candidates. But it seems fairly easy to me to deal with this in the same way that Winsome Earl-Sears did over in Virginia, who was running against Jay Jones, that attorney general candidate who was caught in a private group text saying that the Speaker of the House of Delegates should be killed. What she said, she was asked about this group chat with some of these young Republicans, and she said, yeah, that was terrible. And also Jay Jones, what he said is terrible, and he should stop running for office. Well, I don't understand why that shouldn't be everybody's approach. That seems to me the smartest and most moral approach.
The vice president is very close with somebody who has been attacking you quite relentlessly for a few years now, Tucker Carlson. Speaking of Nazi insignia, Carlson has repeatedly hosted a historian who engages in World War II revision that, in my opinion, aims to portray the Nazis in a less villainous light, shall we say. Charlie Kirk and Megyn Kelly both talk about feeling pressured to cut ties with Carlson. What's your take on the vice president's friendship with Tucker Carlson? Is it significant?
I mean, I'm not going to police friendships between people. I will say that, once again, I think that when people make what are clearly ugly arguments, or when they hide behind guests in order to make ugly arguments without ever asking a single difficult question, or when they continue to use their platforms in order to promote nonsense, then I do think that people of good heart could condemn that. And that has nothing to do with friendship. I think that we all have friends with whom we disagree and who we believe hold bad views. But if we're in the public sphere and we're speaking on public policy all the time and on ideas, then I'm not sure why that should grant some sort of blanket immunity to the criticism of the ideas. I mean, again, there are people in my company with whom I disagree, and we publicly will have those disagreements and air them. I mean, Batya, you and I disagree on a number of things, and I'm sure at some point you've criticized my ideas. I'm sure I've criticized yours, and we're friendly. I mean, I don't really see why these two things are mutually exclusive. I think that there is a bit of a Mott and Bailey game that's going on, where people will refuse to condemn bad arguments, ugly arguments, morally specious arguments. And then when you say you're refusing to condemn those bad, morally specious arguments, and you really should, just because you're willing to express your opinion on everything, why not that? And then they retreat to the Bailey, which is, well, actually, you're just saying I don't want to be friends with. Yeah, I can't be friends. You can be friends with whomever you want. No one's saying that you can't have somebody over for dinner. What we are saying is it's kind of weirdly and oddly uncomfortable that you go silent on views when they are expressed by quote unquote friends, when that friend happens to be a public figure. Nobody's asking you to condemn your Uncle Jim for making a racist joke at the dinner table publicly. That's not what we're talking about here.
So President Trump really inherited a party, which was the party of Reagan, right? It was socially conservative, it believed in free trade, and it believed in American intervention around the world. And Trump pretty much took an axe to all three of those. He's not a conservative, he's a moderate, he supports gay marriage, he believes abortion should not be banned nationally. He really doesn't like free trade, and he doesn't believe in military interventions worldwide. But those are pretty close to your views, that Reagan agenda, and yet you support the president. So explain to us, help me resolve that contradiction.
Sure. So I think that's a bit of a false binary between the two positions. I think that if we go through each one of those one by one, you're right about free trade. The president obviously is a big fan of tariffs. He has also sort of expressed variant views, I will say, on what the purpose of tariffs is. He has on one hand said that they're there to protect American industry. They're there to raise revenues. On the other hand, he said that they're used as leverage in order to lower tariffs. And my hope is obviously that latter justification will in the end be used to actually negotiate away some of these tariff barriers and make deals with countries that, for example, are opposing China geopolitically. When it comes to his sort of domestic social agenda, I mean, this is the president who appointed the justices that overturned Roe versus Wade. So the exaggeration, I think, that he is socially, yes, I mean, on a national level, he's not calling for a ban on abortion, but he also is responsible for the single greatest pro-life movement of my lifetime actually winning. Roe versus Wade being reversed is something I don't think anybody on the right, including me, and I'm an ardent pro-lifer, thought would actually happen at any point. And he is the one who remade the court and then made that happen and champions the fact that he made that happen. When it comes to gay marriage, for example, he obviously is openly pro-gay marriage, but he has also come out extremely strongly against, for example, the transgender ideological movement, which is a very socially conservative position. So it's a little bit more checkered than I think just he's a social moderate. And when it comes to foreign policy, I think this is really where a false dichotomy has been drawn. I think that there are a few streams of foreign policy thought. One is the sort of old neocon, interventionist, let's make democracy everywhere we set our boots idea. That was actually not Reagan's idea. Reagan was not somebody who believed that we had to put democracy everywhere. Reagan was a peace through strength guy. The president of the United States routinely calls himself a peace through strength guy. I don't think anybody wants to involve themselves in sort of random foreign wars. For example, I was not in favor of the American intervention in Libya. I was not in favor of the American intervention in Syria. When it came to Iraq, I think everybody at the time was significantly more pro-Iraq. And then I think at variant levels now have walked that back, given the intelligence that has come out suggesting the original justification for the war was not correct. And obviously hindsight is 2020. The president of the United States, it'd be hard to call him an isolationist, and he would not call himself an isolationist. He himself, he's been on my show talking specifically about his sort of peace through strength positions. He's built up the military. He's not tearing down the military. He's not trying to dismantle the strength of the military. He's trying to actually grow the military by leaps and bounds. He's obviously provided extraordinary aid and support to Israel in its war against Hamas and against Iran. He continues to provide, against, I think, all odds, an extraordinary level of support to Ukraine, whether you say that he's doing that via NATO or not. Those weapons are continuing to flow to Ukraine. He does want to face up to China and the threat that China represents. He's certainly been interventionist with regard to drug boats coming from Venezuela and CIA operations in Venezuela. So again, I think that it's a little bit more nuanced than he's just a sort of clear Pat Buchanan isolationist circa 1992 versus Ronald Reaganism of 1988. I don't think that's perfectly accurate. Let's
talk about abortion. So in the earlier block, we were talking about how, the right really needs to protect the extremists. Part of the argument for me is, they're not the people you need to win. You need the people in the middle, the people who waffle, the people who get really turned off by tolerance for, any of this Nazi rhetoric. I think a very similar argument holds for abortion. I know many women who felt that they could vote for a Republican for the first time because President Trump had so clearly marginalized the Project 2025s of the party, the people who do want a national abortion ban. This is an important issue to them, but it was neutralized because the president came out. Okay, I grant you, not completely on the other side of the party, but certainly slightly to the left of where the party was at. He took the pro-life language out of the GOP platform. Where do you see the party going forward? Do you agree with my analysis that this is extremely important to find that normie middle zone on this? Or do you feel that the abortion issue for the right is a moral issue that supersedes political considerations like this?
Okay, so a few things. One, he took the entire platform out of the Republican platform, right? There was no Republican platform last time. So to single that out, I think would be a little bit of a misnomer. As far as the sort of abortion issue, I think that there are differential approaches, even in the pro-life community, to what is the best way to achieve a sort of pro-life future. There are people who have called for a national abortion ban. I think that that is procedurally inept. I do not think that is likely to happen. I don't think that theoretically could happen, even unless you get a 60-vote majority in the Senate, pro-life majority in the Senate, solid majority in the House. And in fact, the Supreme Court, even in the case overturning Roe, made fairly clear that they believe this is a states' rights issue, not a federal issue. And so once the Supreme Court has made that clear, then this means that it really is up to each individual state. And I think that that is where pro-lifers are looking to really put boots on the ground and change opinions. Obviously, pro-lifers have been very successful in a lot of red states. Places like where I live in Florida, we have a heartbeat bill. There are a lot of other states that have a heartbeat bill. I think that pro-lifers would love to see something similar in California. Whether that is even within the purview of the federal government at all on a constitutional level remains at best an open question. And so I think that what the sort of consensus view inside the Republican Party, which I do think is pragmatic, but I think it's also moral because it's more likely to end with actual pro-life victory in the end, is trying to change hearts and minds on the grounds, on a state-by-state level, where the states do have the constitutional capacity to actually restrict abortion.
Mm-hmm. You and I, about 4 years ago, debated tariffs. We debated free markets. We debated trade. The heart of the debate, I think, came down to we were both talking about the sort of demoralization of the heartland, the working class, deaths of despair. And I argued that this stemmed from the deindustrialization of America and the destruction of these communities from an economic point of view. And you argued that it came from a more spiritual and social point of view. I think in the meantime, the Republican Party really has moved more towards my point of view, certainly with regards to the president's tariff regime, which I think he does see as having a very spiritual component in terms of bringing back the greatness of the heartland and American men, giving them back that self-esteem. I'm wondering if you've changed your mind at all on this issue.
I really haven't. I think that when it comes to the question of whether people need jobs, the answer, of course, is that people do need jobs. I will say, very skeptical of the idea that high levels of tariffs and regulations are going to somehow restore hundreds of thousands of jobs in manufacturing across the heartland, when the reality is that most of those jobs did not go away thanks to foreign trade. Most of those jobs actually went away thanks to technological developments. And that process is likely to accelerate as the price of labor goes up, because more businesses are likely to invest in robots and technology. Amazon, for example, just announced that they're going to be putting robots in a lot of their factories, and they're going to be replacing about 60,000 jobs based on that. That's not foreign trade. That's technology that is now taking over a bunch of those jobs, and new jobs will have to be found. I'm not making an anti-jobs argument. I'm making a reality-based economic argument, which is that we're going to have to find new types of jobs for people, and trying to cling to old idea of factory lines and people working in sort of Fordist ways. I think that's going to go by the wayside just as a practical matter. I do think in the end that the deaths of despair, that the sort of despairing attitude toward life is something that is more cultural than it is economic. I think that you can see it. Tim Carney has talked about this at length in a book called Alienated America, which is really a terrific book, where he compares sort of a demoralized, deindustrializing town, I believe it was in Ohio or Pennsylvania, with one that was in Wisconsin, where they did not have deaths of despair. The difference was the presence of a very vibrant church community. And so the idea that you can sort of fill in spiritual gaps with economic solutions, I just don't think that is likely to end with high levels of success. I suppose we're going to find out, because the president obviously is pursuing your kind of policy.
So what's next for the GOP? Do you think the GOP in 2028 and going forward carries on with the president's more FDR style of, certainly economics, but other things as well? Or do you see a return to the more Reagan free trade version of things?
I mean, I think it depends on the economic performance. I think if the economic performance continues to be solid, there's very little domestic cost to pursuing what I would really think are sort of favoritist policies in terms of economics, because tariffs benefit one group that's pretty conciliated, or a group that's very solid at the expense of sort of a broader populace. That's what a tariff does. It's a subsidy to some at the expense of the consumption of others. if the economy continues to hold up, then that's an easy game to play, and it's a politically lucrative game to play. I don't think that that's the basis of the president's success. I think there's been an attempt to read into President Trump's success a referendum on sort of his economic policies, when in reality, I think the reality is that Trump's success is due to Donald J. Trump, in the same way that Barack Obama's success was due to Barack Obama. And anybody who sort of just copy-pastes his policies and then hopes to remake his coalition, I think is bound to fail. This is, I think, my biggest sort of point of warning for the vice president is that every politician has to have their own coalition. And you can't just remake the coalition of the politician who came before. Hillary Clinton tried this with Barack Obama. It didn't work. And the vice president is incredibly charismatic. He's really good at his job. He's obviously incredibly bright. But if he thinks that he can just kind of take the Trump coalition and remold it and then just push out the same coalition, I don't think it works that way. And I think that you really do, as a politician, have to figure out who you think your coalition is and then work that coalition to a majority.
So you are a person who calls balls and strikes on both sides. What is your reaction to this report that the president is seeking $230 million from the DOJ as recompense for all of the lawfare against him in the first administration and between?
I mean, I think that it's rife with conflicts of interest. I cannot see a world in which that does not end with either a massive number of lawsuits or even an impeachment in the House. Like that is just a bad strategy. And again, I'm incredibly sympathetic to President Trump's argument and that of his family that they've been targeted by law enforcement, that the FBI and the DOJ under Joe Biden particularly went after them in a myriad of horrifying ways. But to pretend that it's not a conflict of interest for the president to ask the DOJ that he appointed to maybe sign him a check for $230 million, even if it's going to go to charity, that obviously raises significant conflicts of interest that I think would be impossible to get around in any sort of legal context.
Yeah, just ending on that same note that we began with, which is why it's so important for the right to police the extremists, because you are very compellingly making the case that this could be a coalition that is larger than what it's been historically. Ben Shapiro, God bless you and protect you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.